book of Samuel is referenced in the Jewish nomenclature as the first book of the Kings. It's the first book of the Kings, and then 2 Samuel is called the second book of the Kings, and then what we know as 1st and 2nd Kings are the 3rd and 4th books of the Kings. So there's a continuation of these 4 books, and then when you look at the Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written very similar in this time frame. Chronicles was written by a different author, primarily written by Ezra on the return of after the return of the Jews into Jerusalem, and so the emphasis is a little different on those 2 books. They emphasize different people. They emphasize the redemptive power of God. They emphasize the return of the people. And so when you look at 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then overlay the Chronicles on top of it, there's 4 books there's 6 books total, overlay a lot. But Ezra was writing from a time frame of emphasizing the temple. And so when you read a lot in the Chronicles, the books are written about that and about the return of the people and the rejoicing and how they're back. The books of the Kings were written mostly by, a lot of them were written by likely Jeremiah, and so those books focus on what Israel did wrong. So when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, when you read through Samuel and read through 1st and 2nd Kings, you will see a lot of this return of this is why we're in the place that we're at. So Jeremiah is writing these books in a very historical context, and Jeremiah is writing as they've gone into captivity. And so when you read through these books, and this is just a general overlay of these books, and when you read through these, you'll see that Jeremiah, if you'll read with the understanding of what's kind of going on, Jeremiah is kind of at that view of like, this is why we're here, why we're at. This is why we're in captivity. This is what we did wrong. This is what we need to learn from. So we're at the very beginning of this story, and we're learning about this a couple of very pivotal people here were introduced in the 1 Samuel chapter 1, and we'll read a good bit this morning as we're talking about this, reading from these 2 people that we want to focus on this morning, primarily looking at 1 Samuel chapter 1. Now there was a certain man from Ramasmith Zophim in the Mount Ephraim, and his name was Echaniah, the son of Jeroboam, the Joraham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, the name of the other was Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, and Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of the city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. The 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. And when the time was that Echaniah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all of her sons and her daughters portions. And to Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And as he did so year by year, and she went up to the house of the Lord, and so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Then said Echaniah her husband to her, Hannah, why weepest thou, and why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am I not better to thee than 10 sons? So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. And she vowed a vow, and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy handmaiden, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaiden, but will give unto thine handmaiden a man-child, and I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. And it came to pass, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaiden for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken thereunto. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. And she said, Let that handmaiden find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. And they rose up early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord, and returned and came into their house in Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord answered her. And it came to pass, when the time had come about after Hannah had conceived, she bare a son, and called his name Samuel, because I have asked him of the Lord. So we've met a couple of interesting characters here. Primarily, this is a story of Hannah. Now, Hannah's went to Shiloh. This is the place that they went. The tabernacle was placed there in Shiloh. This was before the tabernacle had moved to Jerusalem, certainly before the temple was built. So they were worshiping out of the tabernacle, which still moved from place to place. And Shiloh was the place that it had been for some time, and it had been placed there, and that was the place where they went to worship. And so they go there to worship. And Hannah, as we read the story there, we run across Eli. Now Eli was the high priest, and there's a little bit of Eli to be said. Eli was the high priest. We introduced him to his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and we can look a little bit more if we switch over, and we'll jump forward a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about Eli and look at this man that, for the lack of anything better to be said about Eli, this is a man that should have done better. This was a man that they were at a time frame. Now we have to remember where we are historically and where we're at before when we look at these things and look at these things kind of on a bigger picture when we study these to get the full depth of them. And again, I wish I'd kind of had my timeline out that we have on the wall of the class, is where before the kings, and sometimes, and we know these things and when we read the Bible, but sometimes it's good to be reminded of where we're at. So we're after Moses. We're into the book of Judges. This is the time frame of the book of Judges. If you line up where we're at historically, we're at the tail end of the book of Judges, and we're converting over to before there was a kingdom, before David, before Saul was Samuel. Now Eli is the priest at this time. He's the high priest. Some say that he had stepped down as being high priest, and one of his sons was the high priest for part of this. But Eli was there sitting at the temple here. And when we look at Eli, this was a man that really should have done better. We're at the end of the time of the book of Judges. And as you read through the book of Judges and you study the book of Judges, you see one verse over and over and over that people did right what was right in their own eyes. And over you see that the people did what was right in their own eyes because they didn't have the guidance that they should have had. God raised up the judges, but the guidance should have been coming from the house of the Lord. The guidance should have been coming from the high priest. The guidance should have been coming from this office. That office had the ability. There's the high priest garments, and if you study through the high priest garments, there's the lack of a better term, the instruments of God's direction were in the high priest garments, the Urim and Thummim, the things that they would cast, the lots that they would cast to understand what God's will was, to understand what they were to do. This is the role of the high priest, and Eli doesn't fulfill this role. His sons certainly do not fulfill this role. So when we look at Eli, the other man that's a high priest, he should have been the highest office in the land. He should have been the one that was guiding the people. He should have been the one that was leading the people, but he was not. If we skip forward to 2 Samuel chapter 2, we'll pick up the story of Eli again. In 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 12, now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. And the priest's customs with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servants came, and while the flesh was in seething with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand, he struck into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot all the flesh Hook brought up, the priest took for himself. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither. And before they burnt the fat, the priest's servants came and said to the man that sacrificed, Give flesh to roast for the priest, for he will not have sodden flesh of thee, but raw. And if any man said unto him, Let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and to then take as much as thy soul desireth, he would answer him, Nay, but thou shalt give it me now, and if not, I will take it by force. Therefore the sin of the young man was very great before the Lord, for the man abhorred the offering of the Lord. But Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. And his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year. And she came up with her husband to offer yearly sacrifice. And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and said, The Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan that is lent to the Lord. And they went into their own home, and the Lord visited Hannah, so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the child Samuel grew before the Lord. In verse 22, Now Eli was very old, and heard all his sons had did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle for the congregation. And he said unto him, Why do ye these things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all the people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear ye make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the Lord shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. And the child Samuel grew on, and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. So we learn a little bit more about Eli and a little bit more about his household, and we learn a little bit more about them. Now, trying not to get too far into what they were talking about in the earlier verses, in verse 14 and verse 15, they struck into the pan, and that was against how God had commanded Moses that the priests were to get their offering. The priests, and when they were serving, in their time frame of serving, this was the meat that they were supposed to eat. They were supposed to eat meat that had been offered unto the Lord. It was put into a seething kettle, and they reached in with a hook, and what came out was what they ate. And so when you cut up the whole carcass of the animal and you put it into this seething carcass, or into this cauldron, and it was just kind of a blind grab. What you went in and what you got out was the meat that you eat. Now, all of us know, certain cuts of the meat are better than others, and certain cuts do a little better than others. And certainly, if you're picking out which steak that you want, you kind of want the T-bone and the better steaks. And so this is what was going on. They would reach in with the flesh hook, and they come out with a rump roast, and I don't want the rump roast. I want the T-bone. I want I want the better steaks. And so they would go in and specifically say, this is the part of the animal that I want. This is not what I want. And so they were going against the Lord's will on many, many levels. I mean, first of all, picking the meat that they would want. And then they would say, well, if you don't give it to me, I'll take it by force. I mean, can you imagine going to church, and then you walk in to give your offering, and the pastor snatches your wallet and takes what he wants out of it? I mean, it sounds like a good plan for the pastor, but not so much for the church. But this is what was happening. They were going to the temple, or to the tabernacle at the time. They were going to the tabernacle to offer burnt offerings, and the people of Israel were trying there in the middle of everyone doing what was right in their own eyes, and you have the ones that are still faithful, the ones that are still sacrificing, the ones that are still going to offer the offering unto the Lord. And this is what happens. To go to church and to be in a place where you go to church and you just, can you imagine going on a year-to-year basis, and this is what you run into? And there were those that did right in their own eyes, and there was those that were scattered, and there were those that offered incense to Baal. I mean, again, remember, we're in the book of Judges. It's those that were building their own tabernacles, their own temples at home. They were building their own shrines at home to different gods. They were building things to different places, and to worshiping different entities, and worshiping different ones, and doing what was right in their own eyes. And some of them worship to Ashtaroth, and some of them would worship Baal, some of them would worship the different gods that were around them. But there were those that remained faithful. In our story here, we're learning about Elkanah, and he was faithful, and he brought his wives, and on a year-to-year basis, just as a year-to-year, they went year to year. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, it just emphasizes that they would go year to year, and every year he would give sacrifices. He would give to each of his wives, he would give to each of his children things to sacrifice, and this is what we go up, and this is what we do when we go to sacrifice on a year-to-year basis. One of the ones that when the rest were doing what was right in their own eyes, when the rest that were going out, and if you read through the book of Judges, you see time and time again that God punishes, and the people come back to God, and then God punishes, and then they grow cold, and it's generations later, after multiple generations, you'd see 40 years, a couple of generations that people they did the right thing, and they worshiped God, and the country followed the Lord. And then as they began to fall away, there was punishments, and then for 8 or 9 years they would be in some sort of bondage, and then another judge would raise up. And that had been going on for generation after generation. We can read through several hundreds of years that people did what was right in their own eyes, and a judge would come up, and the people would do right for a generation or two, 30, 40 years. They would do what was right, and then they would slide back into doing what was wrong because they just didn't have a whole lot of the guidance that they should have had. For some time frame at the very end of this, we're looking at a man, Eli, who for all intents and purposes had probably been high priest, had probably been leading here. We're probably at 75, 80 years that he had been leading, as we can just figure out the time frame that he at the very end in the next verse in 1 Samuel 2 and 22. Now Eli was very old. We don't know how old he was, but for him to be labeled as very old at this time frame, he was probably close to 100 years old. We're at a time that the lifespans had been shortened. They were no longer as old as they had been, but there was still a consideration for you to be very old. You had to be you had to have a little bit on. Now, I believe it was 100, and I can't remember if Samuel was 120 or 140 when he passed. He was quite old when he passed, so it's reasonable that Eli was a little older than even 100. But going into 100, we could say Eli had been high priest for 75 years of this, that the people had come and the people had gone and had lost their way because of priests such as Eli. Now, who had been the priest before, how that had been beforehand, but you have people those that should have done better. When you look at the life of Eli, that's the only thing that I guess that I could see out of this as the life of Eli, as someone that should have done better. Had all the opportunity. He was the high priest. He was in the lineage. He was the last. Really, you're at a place that God had set up a system in place, starting with Aaron, that there was supposed to be a leader, and the high priest was supposed to be in that leadership position. And while there might have been a more political leader, if we can look at it from Moses and Aaron's standpoint, you had a political leader, but God very carefully did not set up a system originally that was based upon birthright, except for the high priest position. There's not a position of a political leader in God's original plan for Israel. You don't see this political. You don't see Moses' family becoming the next Moses. You don't see them becoming the next Moses. You don't see them passing down a political leadership based on birthright. That was only for the house of God. That was only for God's people. That the high priest is the only one that they had as a leadership position that would go over and over and that would roll one into the other. And this was the role that Eli had, as he was supposed to be the steadfast leader, that we're supposed to know what's going on. Sure, in this time frame we could look and we could say, well, Moses came along, and then it was Joshua that came along, who had no family ties to Moses, that God chooses to raise him up. And so God's choice was God would raise up a political leader. God would raise up someone to lead the people from the political side or from the military side, if you could look at it from that standpoint. But the one that's supposed to be steadfast, the one that's supposed to be the one that we can depend on a basis of one after another is the high priest position. We're supposed to be able to depend upon the church, if you'll allow. We're supposed to be able to depend upon the tabernacle. We're supposed to be able to depend upon knowing what's going on. We have this set of rules. We have this set of regulations. We know that the Mosaic covenant is in place, that if we do these things, if we worship God, if we follow God, then we know what's going to happen. This is said over and over and over. God says in Deuteronomy, if you will, I will. If you look at the book of Judges, if you look at the beginning of the book of Judges, it's laid out yet again. If you'll follow me, then I have the ability to bless you. If you'll do these things, then I have the ability to bless you. It's when the children of Israel lean away from the path, and when they get so far away that God says, I can't bless you because you're too far away. You've wandered too far. I cannot bless you when you're over there. I can only bless you when you're doing what's right. And so when they do what's right in their own eyes and they drift away, then they get to a point that God says, I can no longer bless you. And so they get to the point that they're invaded. They get to the point that the enemy comes in, and then they correct their course, and they come back to worshiping God, and they do away with idols, and they come back to the course of worshiping God. And so they follow God, and you'll see 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, but again, they begin to drift yet away, and they get to the point that God says, I can't bless you. You're away from my protections. And so that happens over and over, but what is supposed to happen is the high priest is supposed to lead them and say, if we'll stay here, if this is what you're supposed to be doing, this is the right way, walk ye in it, this is where we're supposed to stay. And that's the role of the church. That's the role of where we're at in a world that seems like it's gone mad, in a world that seems like they've wandered away. The role of the church is for us to say, this is the right way, walk ye in it. When your family walks away, we say, this is the right way, walk ye in it. When the neighbors wander away, this is the right way, walk ye in it. This is what's right. This is still the correct way. This is still the way to heaven. This is still the narrow way. Broad is the way. You can do whatever you want to over there. That's the broad way. The narrow way is this. This is what's right. And we see that Samuel doesn't do that, Eli doesn't do that in the book of Samuel. We see that Eli doesn't say, this is the right way. His children certainly do not say, this is the right way. They go to the point of not only picking out the food that they want, which seems like, from our standpoint, that doesn't seem like much, but they're just from the very base, the story is that they're just not obeying what they're supposed to do. Yes, you have a very strict lifestyle. You're the high priest. You have a very strict lifestyle because you have a lot of blessings on your life. You have a lot of things that you have that's been given you, but in that responsibility and that great ability, there's a lot of responsibility. I mean, this is the old Uncle Ben quote out of Spider-Man. With those, you got a lot of ability, you get a lot of responsibility. You're the high priest. You have a lot of ability. You're supposed to be leading the charge. You're supposed to be one leading the people. So there is a good bit of responsibility that you have, and this is the life that you're supposed to lead. Sure, you may not like what you're doing, but this is what you do. This is how you act when you're in the temple. This is the lifestyle you lead. This is the clothes that you wear. This is what your clothes are made out of. This is how you wash. This is what you do. That's the covenant that God made with Aaron, and this is the path that you do. And we find Eli and certainly his children not following in it. So when we read through it, the whole point is, so they're picking out the meat, but then you really realize that they're just destroying the covenant that God made with Aaron, that they're not following what they're supposed to do. And then of course it goes even further as it seems like they get away with just, abolishing the Aaron covenant. And then we see that the point that they're sacrificing, they're messing up the sacrifices, and they're destroying how the sacrifices are supposed to be done. But from God's standpoint, they're standing between him and the people. The sacrifices in the middle of people who were doing right in their own eyes. You had those that were still trying to sacrifice. They were still trying to honor the covenant that God had with them. And in the middle of them trying to honor the covenant that God had with them, you have the priest getting in the way. The priests are getting in between the people and God. The priests are standing and saying, no, that's how we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it this way, but this is how it's supposed to be done. I know this is how it's supposed to be done. We come, we offer the sacrifice, the animal is slain, that's the meat, and then you come to, that's not how we're going to do it. And so from God's standpoint, they're destroying all this. So now Eli, in verse 22, Eli's very old, and now we hear that his sons they've gone from just messing with the sacrifices, and now they're sleeping with the women in the door of the tabernacle. So they're sleeping with the women that had assembled, and they're basically using that as a harem. And so they say, and he says, why you do these things? This is evil. So he verbally, but he doesn't change anything that has happened. And so here we are, that the Lord rejects Eli's household. And so in 1 Samuel 2 and 27, and that he comes in and says, then came the man of God unto Eli and said unto him, thus saith the Lord. Now there came a man of God unto Eli and said unto him, thus saith the Lord, did I plainly appear into the house of thy father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon mine altar a burnt sacrifice, to wear an ephod before me? And did I give into the house of thy father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? Therefore kick ye at my sacrifice and mine offerings, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honors thy sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel my people. Therefore the Lord God of Israel saith, I said indeed unto thy house and the house of thy father, that thou shouldest walk before me forever. But now the Lord saith, be it far from me. For them that honor me will I honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days come when I will cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house, and there will not be an old man in thine house. And thou shalt see an enemy in thy habitation, and all the wealth which God shall give Israel. There shall not be an old man in thine house forever. And the man of thee, who I shall not cut off from mine altar, shall be to consume thine eyes and to grieve thine heart. And all the increase of thine house shall die in the flower of their age. And this shall be a sign to thee, that shall come upon thy two sons, upon Hophni and Phinehas. In one day shall die both of them. And I will raise up a faithful priest that shall do all that which is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before mine anointed forever. And it shall come to pass that every one that is left in that house shall come and crouch to him for a piece of silver and for a morsel of bread, to say, put me, I pray thee, into one of the priest offices, that I might eat a piece of bread. So if we look a little further, if we go over a couple of more chapters, we see the end of this story. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, we see the end of the story, that we are his. And so the word of Samuel came into all Israel, and Israel went out, and we're a little bit further along, and I'll just skip down into where we're at here. There's a battle. The Philistines have rose up and are fighting Israel, and Israel's fighting the Philistines and the people. And so in verse 3, when the people were coming to the camp, the elders of Israel said, wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of God out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hands of our enemies. And so the people went to Shiloh, that they might bring from thence the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth between the cherubims. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang. So here we are. Hophni and Phinehas are there, and they've brought the ark of the Lord out of Shiloh. The army is assembled against the Philistines. The army is assembled into a place that they are. And so they've assembled the army, and there's a little bit of a defeat. And so there's a bit of a defeat there. And so they're like, well, here's what we're going to do. We'll bring the ark out of Shiloh, and then we'll be victorious because the ark is present. God will come down and save us when the ark is there. That we'll just make God come, and God will have to help us out, even though we've not been doing what was right, even though we've been doing what was right in our own eyes, that surely when the ark shows up, that everything will get better. So go get the ark. And so here's these two false priests, for the lack of a better term, Hophni and Phinehas, these two priests who've desecrated the temple or the tabernacle, who've desecrated all things that are holy, who's desecrated all that they could do from using the tabernacle as a harem to picking out what they want to eat. If we talk about those two things, which seems to be a great thing and maybe a little bit of a trivial thing, we also realize that everything in between, the Bible talks about those two things that they did, but obviously they did many, many other things that in between the, picking out which meat that you wanted to eat and sleeping with the women in the tabernacle, there's a lot that could go on, and they did all of those things. And so they were just generally just bad guys, but yet they were still the priest, and Eli hadn't rose up and used his authority to remove them away, but God had given them time after time to change their ways because they were the priests. But yet they have they have a curse upon them, that we see a man of God who is unnamed, one of the prophets, if you want to give him that term, that had rose up and said, hey, look, this is what's fixing to happen, and this is the end of the story. We're now a couple of years later through, even though we're only a couple of chapters. We went from Samuel being a very young man, that his mom's bringing him a coat, that now if we read the tail end of chapter 3, Samuel is probably in his teen years at this point, so maybe 5 years or 10 years have passed, ever how long it has been, but God's judgment falls upon them. And so here we are in verse 10, the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent, and there was a very great slaughter. For there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen, and the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. And there ran a man of Benjamin out of the army, and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes rent and with earth upon his head. And when he came, lo, Eli sat upon a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came in the city and told it, all the city cried out. And Eli heard the noise of crying, and he said, what meaneth the noise of this tumult? And the man came in hastily and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were dim, and he could not see. And the men said unto Eli, I am he that come out of the army, and I fled today out of the army. And he said, what is there done, my son? And the messenger answered and said, Israel is fled before the Philistines. And there hath been also a great slaughter among the people, and thy two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, is dead, and the ark of God is taken. And it came to pass, when he made mention of the ark of God, he fell from the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck broke, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. And his daughter-in-law, Phinehas, his wife, was with child, near to be delivered. And when she heard the tidings that the ark of the God was taken, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself and travailed, and her pains came upon him for the time of her. And about the time of her death, the woman that stood by her said unto her, fear not, for thou hast borne a son. And she answered not, neither did she regard it. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory is departed from Israel, because the ark is taken, and because their father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken. What an end of a dark chapter for Israel. What an end of a dark chapter for the people. Eli's 100 years old here, and he's judged for 40 plus years. He's supposed to have been the sole leader. He had been in the position of the priest his whole life. He had been a priest his whole life. And so for 40 years, he had been the high priest. And for years before that, he had been in the tabernacle learning. And for years before that is what he had always done. But he should have been a man leading the people of Israel. But yet we see him presiding over the decline. We see him being there as the decline just slides further and further away. Now, certainly this chapter has a lot of light in the end of it, because what happens next is to be. But if we look at the end of chapter 3, there's the hope, and the hope is that God doesn't leave his people hopeless. The end of chapter 3 in verse 21, and the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And before that, and all of Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. Now, going back and looking at Samuel, and you come to the young adult class, we'll talk about Samuel next week. You can get that lesson. But we'll talk about how he is in this perfect position, but yet not only was he in a perfect position, but yet he fulfills the duties that he's supposed to have. We see Eli as a man that just should have done better. It's really all that you can say about Eli as you just look and just wasted potential, they're just wasted opportunity. But yet it's not something that he leads alone. It's not something that he alone suffers from. You see that the people of Israel suffer because of his lack of leadership. You see that his people, that the congregation that he should have been leading, the families that are destroyed. 30,000 footmen die in a single day because of the lack of the leadership of Eli. So yes, this is a man that had all the opportunities. Yes, this is a man that should have done better. But we have to realize that what we do doesn't affect just us. What we do doesn't affect just us. And we've heard that from this pulpit over and over from our pastor, that what we do doesn't affect just us. That we realize that Hophni and Phinehas died because of their father, because of their own choices. But in the end, this was the leadership of someone that was not the leader that he should have been, was not leading as he should have been. At the very least, he should have pulled his sons from the priesthood. He should have punished them. They should have died for what they had done. Their sins equaled death. Looking at the Mosaic law, for what they'd done, they should have been killed. And that was the only just and right course. But because he does not do that, 30,000 other people die in a single day. Not counting who had died the day before in the previous battle, not counting what had happened in the other years before, not counting the stolen crops that the Philistines had, not counting the rampage that happened because the Philistines now took over Israel, not counting those that died on an annual basis because of the Philistines are now in control of Israel, not counting all of that. We could count up probably hundreds of people hundreds of thousands of people that suffer now on a several annual basis until God once again reigns supreme, until we see that God raises up a king in Saul, that they're once again be able to take over. And it's not until David takes over till the Philistines are finally totally destroyed because of Eli's negligence, because of what Eli did. We have to realize that our choices play a role in what we are, not only in who we are and what happens to us and what we do and in our daily ones and twos and what happens for us. But we realize the choices that we make when we do not hold the line, that they play a role in our families, they play a role in our neighborhood, they play a role in our community. How much more when we look around, when we see a church, when we look in the broader terms of the Church of America that says, oh, this is okay. Yeah, this is okay. This is not bad. You can do this. You can live this way. You can, God will accept that. That's good enough. That'll be fine. This will be okay. That's all right. Surely God will forgive. Surely this will be okay. But when we see a world that's looking for guidance and looking for direction, how far, if Eli would have seen 20 years before, 10 years before, what his end actions would be, how much would he have changed? I don't know. How much would we can see that our world has been into tumult because they do not have a church as a large body that says this is wrong. And all we can pray for is the same thing that happened with Eli and Samuel. There is a revival that will come. Samuel grows up in a community that this is what Samuel grows up in. He literally grows up in this. He's given to God. He lives in the tabernacle on a daily basis. This young man from when he was just several years old, when his mom brings him back, and we didn't read that part of the story, when his mom brings him back to the tabernacle and drops him off, there he lives, visited by his family once a year, that his mom comes and checks on him and sees him, but he lives on a daily basis in this same tabernacle, in this same environment. But somehow this young man had it in his heart that I'm going to serve God right in the middle of these things. And such as it can be in our life, in the middle of a tumult situation, in the middle of everybody else doing what is right in their own eyes, in the middle of everybody else just doing their thing, we can be ones that say, this is what I'm going to do. You can do what you want to do. You can live like you want to live. You can have whatever it is that you want to have. This is the right way. Walk ye in it. And we see eventually this is what happens. Samuel rises up. Samuel takes his position and says, I don't care what everybody else has done. I don't care what everybody else has said. I don't care what everybody else has done. This is what I'm going to do. And such is the story that we should have. In the middle of a person that should have done better, in the middle of a life that we see Eli that should have made different choices, in the middle of a world that we live in that we see people that should have made different choices, we realize our choices are our own. Yep, we have to live here. Yep, this is where we are. Yep, this is the time frame that God chose for us to live in. I mean, we might have liked it better. If we were, as I say, we could have been in the time frame of Pa Ingalls and got on our wagon and rode out west and built us a sod hut and lived by ourselves. And every time I heard the sound of somebody else's axe, I was ready to move. But that's not when God chose for me to live. He chose for me to live in such a time as this. And so my decisions are, what decision am I going to make? My decision has to be, what role am I going to play? Am I going to be like Eli and say, it's good enough, it'll be fine, and watch the world slide off? Or am I going to be like Samuel said, nope, this is the way that God said it should be, and this is the way I'll live? Good to be here this morning.